So, Geordie, there's been a new word that I've seen floated around in the media a lot over the last, especially over the last week. It's a word that I'd heard of before, and I'd seen, kind of limited usage, but it seems to have exploded in popularity. And everyone in the kind of political commentary class is using this word excessively. I've heard even some people say that it is the most beautiful word in the world, more beautiful than love itself. That word is tariffs.
Yes.
So it appears that this is a central part of Donald Trump's policy, is these things called tariffs.
Yes.
Can you please explain to someone like myself what a tariff is and how it affects us?
Well, firstly, James, I should mention that we discussed tariffs for the first time last year, last year, when Trump went on Joe Rogan's podcast.
He did.
And repeated those exact words you put out there for us, that it is the most beautiful word, more beautiful than love.
But not religion.
But not religion.
Of course.
Yes. Yeah. So tariffs have been making the news, correct? So tariffs are a tax on produce coming into the United States.
Yep.
It is a tax once it has been imported. So basically, once it passes customs inside the United States, there's a tax levied against that product by the United States federal government. Trump is wishing to use these tariffs in a number of ways. That's what he's telling us.
Yeah.
But I think first we should probably talk about the tariffs on Australia, and then we can discuss a little bit as to what the tariffs may do for the global trading order, the global economy, and for the US at large. What he would like the tariffs to do, should I say. But first of all, I think we should discuss about what tariffs mean in Australia and what's happened so far.
Fantastic, mate. Or just obviously to preface as well, this is kind of one of the major pillars of his policy proposal that he came into office on. So he was, I think, going out and again claiming that there's this kind of magical cure-all to all of America's kind of economic woes, and that would be tariffs. And as we discussed previously on the podcast, and like you just said, it's a tax levied on imported goods. So essentially, if I was to say, if you were to import $100 worth of apples from me, and you put a 20% tariff on the apples, you would receive the same amount of apples, but you would be paying $120 for it.
Correct.
I would be receiving the same amount of money, they $100 still, but that extra 20% would go to the government of said nation.
To the federal government in the United States, correct.
And I think just to clarify that, because I think there was a bit of misunderstanding when he first announced this. I know we talked about it. I think there was the consensus amongst the US population that didn't know much about it, was that it would be the other countries paying for these tariffs.
Correct. As I said at the beginning there, this tariff is a tax levied against a product being imported into a country.
All right. Let's just clarify that.
that. Okay. So, a couple of weeks ago, before we get up to Liberation Day, which will go down in history.
It will.
As one of the greatest days in the US, there was a 25% tariff levied against Australian steel and aluminium exports into the United States. It wasn't a huge thing because I think only it's 0.02% of our exports are aluminium and steel to the US. However, it does account for about $500 million worth of aluminium and steel going into the United States. And one of the companies that will be affected by this is BlueScope Steel here in Australia. So they export, I think it's about $250 million aluminium and $250 million worth of steel to the US. That is obviously going to affect that somewhat.
So is the idea that it would drive up the price of imported Australian steel for Americans?
Correct.
So then theoretically Australian steel is therefore going to be less desirable,
more expensive
on the US market because it's more expensive, and therefore we will theoretically export less of it to the US.
So BlueScope Steel, this I think really highlights the intricacies of the global economy and how tariffs like this, blanket tariffs, have so many repercussions you don't really know what's going to happen once you levy them. So, for instance, BlueScope Steel has a facility inside the United States. I think it's in Ohio, was it? And they hire about 4,000 US workers. So while this company is going to be hit from these tariffs here in Australia, they're also at the same time hiring US workers in the United States.
Yeah.
So you've got to kind of take these things into account.
So he's destroying US jobs to start off with. A good start. Continue.
A great start.
Yeah.
So that was aluminium and steel. At the same time, there has now been, since Liberation Day, a 10% blanket tariff placed on all goods
Imported.
into the United States from Australia.
And obviously there's varying... Sorry, continue. Sorry.
So this is a 10% blanket tariff. It's mostly going to affect Australia's beef industry, our beef exports, because the United States does import a significant amount of Australian beef. And what was interesting is that Trump said that these blanket tariffs were justified because Australia didn't import, we banned, US beef. Looked into this a little bit. It's a bit more complicated than that.
Yeah.
We don't actually ban importing US beef. What we ban is beef where we don't know the origin of.
Yeah.
So the cattle that comes into the United States, for example, comes from Mexico and other countries.
Yeah.
So if they can't prove where the beef originally comes from, Australia doesn't allow it into the country.
Of course.
Because obviously we don't have mad cow disease here.
Yeah.
So we like to protect our Australian beef industry.
Yeah, and we also, in terms of biosecurity, being an island...
Yes.
Kind of a fragile ecosystem. That's one
why.
thing that all the Australian governments have tried to protect.
So this concern for our biosecurity is one of the things that Trump has labelled a kind of protectionist policy.
Yeah.
Which I would sort of have to disagree with in some ways.
Yeah.
One of the other things they've targeted is our pharmaceutical benefit scheme, is where the Australian government actually purchases pharmaceuticals from the United States, because most of the patents that we purchase come from US pharmaceutical companies, and then they provide the pharmaceuticals to the Australian public at a really subsidised rate.
Yeah.
So I think it's about $35 for most of the base prescriptions that you can purchase, and this is for life-saving medication for people with diabetes, heart disease, etc., etc. That is seen by the US as a, once again, protectionist policy. The pharmaceutical industry in the United States has not been happy about this for some time, but just recently they've really started to lobby Congress and specifically the Trump administration, saying that this kind of stifles innovation, growth, competition,
Of course.
All the classic kind of capitalist mantra.
Yeah, well, look, nothing stifles innovation and growth and competition like, charging someone $200,000 for life-saving cancer medication, for example.
That's right.
Yeah.
So under the PBS, so just recently in a recent submission to the US government, the pharmaceutical industry has described the PBS as an egregious and discriminatory, limiting prices, earning and, quote, undermined American competitiveness, jobs and exports. So... on top of the PBS, we also have the Australian Media Bargaining Code, which is basically where the Australian federal government subsidises a lot of the big media corporations here in Australia. So obviously most famously Murdoch, Channel 9, etc. And then in 2021, you actually might remember this.
I do remember this, yeah.
Is when our news suddenly disappeared from social media. And that was because the Australian government wanted the big tech companies to pay for Australian news. When I say the Australian government, it was actually the Australian News Corporation that wanted the social media companies to pay for the news. So that has also been looked at as an unfair practice by the Australian government. So obviously, big tech in America doesn't want to have to pay for our news. Yeah. However, it's funny because at the same time, having the news on their platforms is also a form of free advertising.
Of course.
So when you go onto your social media, onto your Facebook feed, you obviously see like The Guardian, The Economist, etc. So that's a form of advertising for these news outlets. So that's one of the other things that Trump has levied against the Australian government. Yeah. All in all, what I think is most fascinating about this is kind of all the rhetoric surrounding it. So obviously, in some ways, it's not going to affect Australia all that much, and it might not affect global trade all that much because... Sorry?
No, I was going to say, because I know we have a massive trade deficit with the US.
Yes.
Yes. So this doesn't seem to help Trump's logic, for example. This doesn't seem to adhere to his logic that he's using by saying we have a trade deficit with all these countries, we're being ripped off, whereas Australia, they actually have a trade surplus with Australia.
Correct. So what Michael Pascoe has pointed out, so he is an Australian economic journalist who writes for Michael West, and he pointed out that the United States doesn't have a federal GST or VAT. So they don't actually have a consumer tax at a federal level. They do in some of the states. However, basically what he's arguing is that what these tariffs will just do will provide a consumer tax for the federal government. So people are still going to consume things and buy things. They're going to pay a tax from these tariffs, and then that tax is just going to go to the federal government.
Of course, yeah.
So he said it really should just be looked at that.
So they're just raising their government revenue, essentially.
Raising their government revenue. And then obviously most famously we had a 10% GST increase under the Howard government. And at the time the Reserve Bank of Australia actually looked through the GST and didn't account it towards inflation. And so likely the Fed in the US is going to do the same.
Yeah.
They are just going to kind of disregard the tariffs as being inflationary.
Yes.
So a lot of people at the moment are saying that this is going to hurt a lot of Americans, it's going to be inflationary. Well, there's a good chance that the Fed's just not even going to pay attention to the statistics.
Yeah, well, the price has gone up. That's not inflation.
Yeah, it's not inflation. It's just a tariff. It's not part of inflation.
Yeah,
it's a tariff.
Of course.
You're not actually paying for it anyway. China's paying for it. So at the end of the day, it doesn't matter.
Yeah. I do think it's funny how the United States over the last, say, 80 years has kind of been the champion of global free markets, essentially, and of kind of global, like liberalisation of global trade. So that has always allowed their domestic population to have like really cheap access to consumer goods and products from foreign markets. And they've been the one that has been the primary champion of this, much to the detriment and the underdevelopment of lots of these producer countries.
Yeah.
So it's funny how he's now flipping this whole thing around.
Yeah, it is quite
and saying,
funny.
we've been so badly ripped off by exploiting the rest of the world. It's just a really funny kind of political juxtaposition, I find.
Oh, no, it's absolutely hilarious, definitely. Yeah. And what's came out, though, is when under the first Trump administration, these 25% tariffs were levied against Australian steel and aluminium. And at the time, Turnbull managed to get an exemption on the tariff. This time, obviously, we haven't, because as we're seeing, this second Trump administration is a lot more hard in its bargaining approach, you could say.
Do you think Peter Dutton would be able to get an exemption?
Well, he obviously said that Albanese should have flew over to the US immediately.
Yeah.
And basically
he should have rimmed Donald Trump. That's exactly what I'd do.
He should have licked the boots of the emperor and got an exemption on the tariffs.
Kiss the ring.
However, what's come out now is that what did happen was that some Australian officials used Australia's natural minerals to try and bargain with the Trump administration and said that we would use our minerals and supply a kind of a safe ongoing supply of minerals to the United States if they drop the tariffs.
Yeah. This doesn't sound like a very good deal, dude.
No, it's terrible.
Like this,
absolutely terrible.
Because to my knowledge, it doesn't sound like our main trade exporter is China.
Yeah.
So we have a trade deficit with the US.
Correct.
So if we stop exporting stuff to the US, it doesn't, like for Australia, it doesn't seem like there's probably far greater layers of economic complexity that my tradie brain cannot fathom, but it doesn't seem like a huge, massive loss at the end of the day.
No, it's not going to affect a lot of our exports. As Richard Dennis from the Australia Institute pointed out, if you're an American and you're in the US and you buy a cheeseburger and it has Australian Wagyu beef in it, you're going to pay 40 cents more for the Australian beef.
Yeah.
And if you like cheeseburgers, you're going to pay that 40 cents more.
You're just going to weather the cost.
You're going to weather the cost.
Yeah.
Correct. And after reading that article, it made me realise that I think this is just being levied as a standard tax because the federal government's never had a consumption tax in America. And they've realised, like, hang on a sec, if we want to do things...
We need fund our military, for example.
We need a federal tax.
Yes. Oh, it's interesting as well because I guess that framing of like calling it a tariff, not a tax, obviously, because that's the whole kind of MAGA libertarian ideology.
Yes.
You know, the Tea Party, no taxation without representation, etc. It's very much anti that kind of that overarching government tax. However, you're achieving the same thing through different kind of streams, I guess, shall we say?
So if you change the language, as you pointed out, you change the meaning.
Yeah.
And so when you change the meaning, you can change the discourse around it.
Yes.
And then that's when people say, it's not a tax, we're going to make China pay for it.
Yeah,
it's just it's incredibly depressing, but at the same time, it's really interesting to observe it. It really is.
A couple of things I want to point out. So famously, Trump referenced in his talking about tariffs in the past, he referenced the tariffs put in place in the late 19th century.
By McKinley.
Yes.
Former US president, I believe.
At the time. And
this is in the 1860s, 1880s?
yeah, late 19th century.
Maybe even 1890s.
I think it was 1890s, yeah.
Sorry, yeah.
However, I do know for a fact that precipitated the biggest global recession that had ever been had at the time, or US recession in, I think, 1896 or 1897, I believe. And lots of kind of economic historians have pointed to his implementation of these tariffs as being one of the major factors that caused that.
So, yeah, McKinley towards the end dropped the tariffs.
Yeah.
I think he sort of realised that they were kind of counterintuitive and detrimental. They were also, at the time, used to foster and support American industry in its, like, when it was infantile. When it was still growing. And this was, like, agrarian
Back
industry.
in, like, the Rockefeller days, for example.
Yeah, that's right. It wasn't used then once, like, America's industry was still developing. It's not like now where it's in the 21st century. America has a developed industry and they're just using these tariffs as a blanket measure. And no, you're right. Trump is definitely trying to be somewhat more protectionist. Kevin Rudd recently came out and said this, is that Australia needs to understand this administration is a lot more transactional. It's a lot more protectionist. And it genuinely thinks that these tariffs are going to help American industry. However, I would argue that without a vigorous industrial policy, investment in infrastructure, education and skills, you can't just use tariffs as a blunt instrument to bring back American industry.
Of course. You need a massive kind of industrialization plan, the likes of which America had in like the 30s, the 40s and the 50s, for example. A New Deal, like an Eisenhower era kind of public infrastructure investment.
Which America's not doing at the moment.
No, of course not, because that would obviously impede corporate profits. Another thing I wanted to bring up as well was I do find it funny that everyone got tariffed. Everyone got tariffed. I even saw Israel got tariffed, which I was like, that's hilarious. But it doesn't seem like the way that they have calculated, because it says, you know, he's released this hilarious big chart.
It was quite comical.
It was quite comical. It was like when you win something on a game show and they walk in with this massive check. That's what it reminded me of, in true Trumpian kind of gaudy fashion. But he was talking about, obviously, the tariffs they're imposing on said countries. But the next that it had the percentage of tariffs that these countries impose on the US. Which I don't think is real. I don't think that exists. I don't think we have tariffs on US goods.
We don't. But what they did was they took those protectionist measures, scare quotes. They used that as a way to justify the tariffs themselves. So they said because we actually protected some of our biosecurity, biodiversity, as you said before, they accounted that as a quote-unquote tariff.
Of course.
So they just said, that's a tariff, so we'll give you a
So it's just an arbitrary number.
It was
an arbitrary just percentage, so they just pulled out and whacked on there.
Correct, that's right.
That's very interesting.
And then the way they obviously calculated the tariffs?
Yes.
Hilarious.
Yes.
Absolutely hilarious.
We were discussing this earlier.
So they managed to get the trade deficit, and then they divided that by the total, I think it was value in US dollars of trades exported by the other country. And then because it was a smaller number over a larger number, you got a negative number. Times that by 100, you got a percentage, and then divided it by 2. So just completely arbitrary. Again, it doesn't seem to be based on anything really substantial or concrete. No.
It's quite funny.
Hilarious.
I do have to say, it is very funny. So what's the plan?
Okay, so
because I'm trying to figure out, I'm trying to piece it together. I think, what are they, like, the US stock market, I think, lost $2 trillion in the last week, in like market capitalization, I believe.
Yeah, but to quote the US Treasury Secretary, the US stock market was going great before the 2008 financial crisis, and it just collapsed overnight.
It did. That's true.
So you have to crash the stock market now in order for it to grow later.
Of course, yeah.
But what... one of the
economists.
No, but seriously, these tariffs are a tax that are going to pay for several things.
Yeah.
So over the weekend, a bill passed Congress, and this bill is going to solidify Trump's tax cuts. So his tax cuts that he
Previously
implemented
Yeah.
in the first administration. They expired this year. Mm-hmm. And now he is going to make them permanent with this bill. And it is $4.5 trillion over the next 10 years.
Wow. Good thing he got elected then.
Correct.
Good thing he got elected.
And in that bill, there was a further $2 trillion in cuts to Medicaid and food stamps.
Yeah, I do remember that being one of his election promises, that he would not touch Medicaid and social services.
Correct.
Yeah.
And those tax cuts will fuel the US deficit by another $5 trillion over the next 10 years.
Wow. Bravo.
Correct.
So, good man. All right. Further pushing your population into absolute penury.
Yes, abject poverty.
But this is what I'm trying to figure out is, what is the overall plan? Like, is this overall part of some grand kind of imperial strategy of reorganisation that they're undertaking? Because I do see it as a complete shift in their approach to like the liberal rules-based international order, so to say. Whereas they've always had this kind of liberal internationalism, free trade, everyone trades globally, and as much as it benefited them, up until now they've been the primary benefactor, they have now switched around. So they've kind of switched their position entirely. So I'm trying to think, are they just going to go back to old school, like direct imperialism, just gunboat diplomacy?
No, not necessarily. I think just like with war, there's always many reasons for it and many outcomes. I think there's tariffs, there's many reasons, there's many outcomes. I think, as I had previously said about the taxes, I think this is just a tax for the federal government to use to implement Trump's
tax cuts.
So
this is all it is?
No, it's not all it is. It's not all it is. I think that is a really significant part.
Yeah.
Like that bill just passed over the weekend.
Yeah.
That bill and implementing his tax cuts and these tariffs didn't just coincide. They happened together.
Of course, yes.
Like they are directly linked to one another. At the same time, though, I think what he's trying to do is he's trying to kind of break up the kind of globalized trade order. He wants there to be blocks. He wants there to be the US bloc with its allies. He wants them in servitude. He wants us begging to give our minerals to them.
Yeah.
He wants Canada to be basically a part of the US trading bloc. He wants Greenland, et cetera, et cetera. And then he wants there to be the Western Europe, where he kind of brings the euro to its knees. And then he wants like a Russia, China, Southeast Asia trade bloc. He just wants to break them up. And then he wants to use these tariffs as leverage inside the blocks.
Of course.
That's the way I'm kind of perceiving it as well.
So again, it's as much of a political tool as much of an economic tool.
Correct.
For example, because then he can come to the Australian leader and say, we will take off these tariffs if you stop subsidising, like medicines.
Your medicines, that's right.
Yeah, and then then you can all be medically bankrupt like our population is.
Correct, that's right.
Yeah, just to save, $200 million in steel exports or whatever it would work out to be.
Correct.
That's disgusting. Very interesting though, and I like you said, I do like the kind of more direct transactional approach. Like they're not they're not sugarcoating it with that kind of, the liberal rules-based international order, all the kind of stuff we saw from the Biden administration and stuff like that.
Yeah. So there was a really interesting quote that I read coming out of the Trump administration, and this is one of his staffers. And they said that globalization was sacrificing the nation state in favor of the empire, and America first is sacrificing the empire in favor of the nation state.
Oh. That's interesting.
And I do think that's how they say it.
That is how they say it.
They think the Trump administration thinks that the empire just costs too much money to run.
Well,
They don't see all the net benefits from it, though, for the ruling class and for the economic elites in the country.
Yeah.
And he thinks, for example, that having a trade deficit is a bad thing. So a trade deficit just means that you import more items than you export with the country.
Of course. But the logic, again, again, I'm not an economist, but...
Neither am I.
For example, I don't think any of these guys are either. But so, for example, if I have if I sell things to you in US dollars, right?
Yes.
That means if I have a trade surplus with you, that means I have a surplus. If you're America, I'm Singapore, whatever.
China, Japan, whatever.
That means I have a surplus of US dollars.
Yes.
So if I have these dollars, then I use these dollars to buy more American products and to invest back into the US stock market to keep inflating the bubble, for example. So this is what I don't understand. If he wants to reduce the trade, that means the other countries aren't going to have the surplus US dollars to invest back into the US.
So I don't know if him or anyone
I'm so confused,
administration really understands. No, you pointed this out, is that the US is the first empire to run a massive deficit like this, but also that is the fuel of its economic power.
Yes.
They run a deficit. They run a deficit with China because what they're able to do is print US dollars, which costs nothing for them. They're able to import all these cheap Chinese goods. All those US dollars go to China. And then the Chinese, with all these US dollars, invest back into US real estate, into their fire sector, into their banks, and they buy US treasury bonds, US debt, which fuels the US Treasury and the US empire.
And then so they can just keep expanding further,
and keep expanding, keep running these massive deficits. Because without the trade imbalance, you can't run these massive deficits. You can't keep spending over $1 trillion every year on the US military. So it is from their trade imbalance and their deficit spending that they get this power.
Well, yeah, because as soon as I started understanding this, it kind of clicked to me that, for example, that's why the Saudis, for example, are the biggest purchaser of overpriced US military goods, because they have all these US dollars, because they sell all this oil in US dollars, so they have this massive surplus, and there's nothing really to spend it on. So, but in order to keep that circular money flow going, where you just have to overinflate the price of subpar military goods, like $200 for a hammer or whatever, and then send it over to them. That just keeps that cycle going along.
So this is never spoken about in any of the mainstream analysis done on the tariffs.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that we have inside knowledge here at Left Hook Media. No, seriously. No, it took us a long time to figure this out. And it was reading, for example, and listening to Michael Hudson, an American economist. He was back in the 1970s. He was one of the first people to actually figure out how the system works, elaborate on it. He's written an entire book on it.
He's written many.
He's written many books on it. But when you listen, if you turn on the ABC, if you turn on any of the mainstream Western media outlets, no one talks about the trade deficit and how it powers the US empire.
Of course.
It's from their trade deficit that they're able to spend these massive budgets on the US military and run an empire. The British couldn't do that.
No.
All the other Western European countries never could do that.
Of course. They weren't as sophisticated in that regard, in their kind of financial instruments that they use.
That's right.
But I do find it interesting because at the end of the day, and this is the same as the British Empire, French, the Spanish, the US, comes down to the same thing of, well, the expansion of the empire doesn't actually materially benefit the average working person.
No.
They're not at all benefited by the empire.
Except for also cheap imports.
Or cheap imports, of course.
Cheap consumer goods from China, for example.
But at the expense of hollowing out domestic industry and domestic production as well.
That's right.
So, you're essentially, the empire is subsidised by the public and the working class.
Yes.
And all the profits go to the ruling class.
Yes, and their jobs are stripped from them.
Yes, because I remember listening to the great British historian Niall Ferguson discussing this.
Yeah.
And he was kind of like an apologist for the British Empire, and he was talking about, we civilised the savages. That was kind of his thing. But he talked about how the British Empire was a benevolent force. We didn't have to do it. I mean, look, it was costing the British crown. Just, we were in a massive deficit trying to fund the empire. We did it out of the goodness of our hearts. And it's like, no, it's because all that money came back. It just didn't come back into the state coffers. It went into the private coffers.
Into the private coffers,
Yeah,
yes.
so that was interesting. That kind of clicked for me in that respect. I do think, obviously it's a major shift in their attitude and their approach. And I'm wondering if this is the kind of thing that, in order to fulfill... I'm going under the assumption that there's more to this at play than just funding tax cuts. Of
course. Yeah.
There has to be more at play. If it's just that, then bravo, sir. Dedication to the cause. But...
Well, no, as I said, I think that's one of the reasons. But
it has to be.
It's going to give him a lot of leverage in negotiations.
Yeah.
I think he wants to isolate all the trading blocks.
Yes.
And then use the tariffs in negotiations with those countries.
It's amazing.
To strike out better trade agreements with the US.
It's amazing how just like blatantly pro-corporate the man is, though.
Yeah.
Like, it is so funny. Like, obviously the Dems weren't like, there wasn't much difference between them, but they'd still gone about, we need to bring up the working class and empower minorities, and Trump's just like, nah, man, like, we need just more money. Like, it's fucking hilarious. I do think, in terms of a historical analysis of various fascist leaders go, I just don't think he has it in him to be a full-blown fasci. Like, I just don't think he has the conviction. You look at, like, a Mussolini, for example, had these grand plans of, like, bringing back the Roman Empire, had a staunch chin on him. Obviously, like, Franco in Spain, he had that weird kind of suppressed, like, sexual urges that he just, funneled into, like, extreme, kind of religious rhetoric. Suharto in Indonesia is happy to kill 1 million people. Pinochet in Chile. Yeah, if you're a poet who makes subversive music, that's cool. We'll just throw you out of a helicopter. I can't see Trump having the balls to do any of these things.
No.
And I do find it funny because how will they, like, again, the shit is fascist. At least be like Mussolini. At least have a staunch chin. You know what I mean?
What's interesting is
that's my analysis.
What all those men have in common is they all came from the military.
Well, they did.
And they also all had a political project that they're pursuing. Trump has never been in the military.
No.
I don't think he's ever had a difficult day in his life.
No.
And I don't think he has a political project apart from being pro-corporatist.
Yeah, exactly. But that's what I mean. Like, he's just doing like tax cuts. It's like, dude, you're literally like this table is the global kind of trading system. You're just flipping the table up just for the tax cuts.
That's right.
I get the dedication is amazing. Like, in my most creative state, I would never be able to think up of something that wild.
That's right.
Hilarious.
Yeah. But also, you got to remember that the reason the US lost a lot of jobs, manufacturing jobs, and it's kind of been hollowed out over the past 20 to 30 years, is not because of the trade deficit and not because China stole the goods. It's because US capitalists realized it was more profitable to take their industries offshore to where there was no environmental regulation.
No workers' rights.
There was cheap jobs and expanding markets.
Yeah.
And cheap raw commodities.
Of course. Yeah. So it's not the fault of the China.
Yeah.
As he would say.
And for those industries to come back to the United States, as we said previously, there needs to be an industrial policy, the likes it would have to be like the New Deal, for example.
Yeah, of course.
Blanket tariffs aren't going to achieve that.
And the political conditions that emerged from aren't present in the US at the moment. They don't exist.
No, they're not. No. And as a lot of economists point out, the United States probably does need to reindustrialize, except just tariffs alone aren't going to do that. Also, if the working class in America is able to live relatively, and I say that very cautiously, relatively good lives compared to some other countries, is because of cheap consumer goods coming into the US. And to reindustrialize, you're going to lose some of those cheap consumer goods. And with their current level of wages and skills, it's not possible at the moment. It's going to have to take 10, 20, 30 years, and it's going to have to be a project that the consecutive US administrations work on, and by taxing their corporate sector to do so,
of course,
which they did in the New Deal.
Yeah, but that defeats the whole purpose of what we're doing now.
And what Trump is doing, he's not doing that. That's the whole point. He's giving out massive tax breaks.
Yeah, wild. And I think to reindustrialize, they'd have to lower the wages and living conditions of the average American to just abject serfdom or techno-feudalism, honestly, it'd be a state. You kind of quasi cyber corporatist, system.
And as I read the other day, the initial tariffs he put on in the last administration decreased America's imports and exports, so it didn't affect the trade deficit whatsoever.
Of course, it just went down. Proportionately.
Proportionally, it didn't affect it whatsoever.
Good man.
And what might end up happening is the rest of the global economy just strikes out trade agreements with one another and keeps trading. And America just sort of recedes away from that kind of globalized economy somewhat.
That they have, again, been the primary benefactor
and once again, this was their entire, the global economy as it is today was their design and plan over the 20th century.
Yes.
All these institutions that Trump wants to pull out of, the United States created and benefit from. It's
wild, man. Absolutely wild. I am still... going to operate under the false hope of the assumption that Trump is somehow a god emperor of mankind.
Okay,
And this is this is the first step to a really long, convoluted and opaque plan to benefit the US population and the global population as a whole. I'm still going to hold out on that.
Yeah.
Because it's funny.
Yeah.
And also, like, I'm just going to assume there's more depth to this than what we're seeing right now.
I would like to think so. I doubt it.
Yeah.
As every single economist, pundit, analysis, etc., that I have read and listened to over the past week all agree that this is not a well thought out plan. This is not a good idea. And I don't think the historians in 50 years will look back at Liberation Day as being significant as, for example, the independence of the United States from the British Crown.
Yeah, you don't
or the Constitutional Convention when they wrote the Constitution. And the Declaration of Independence. I do not think that these things can be compared. So let's leave it at that, and we will see what happens.
Yeah, we'll see what happens in the future.
Sorry for that long segment. It might have been a little bit of a tangent at points. There's a lot of moving parts.
There's a lot to take in, but you know what? We're only going to see the outcome of this in 6 months' time, in a year's time,
Correct.
in 2 years' time,
as
tides and currents shift and adapt to what is being done here.
It will be fascinating to see.
Fascinating.
All right, James, we'll leave it at that.